Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The summer of 2021 had been brutal in southern Manitoba. Our family cabin, nestled deep within 80 acres of dense woodland, had become a sweltering prison during the afternoon hours. The ancient air conditioning unit wheezed and rattled, providing little relief from the suffocating heat that seemed to press down like a heavy blanket soaked in sweat. I wiped the perspiration from my forehead as I stared out the grimy window at the endless expanse of trees that surrounded our property. The forest stretched in every direction, its canopy so thick that even at midday shadows pooled beneath the branches like dark water. My family had retreated to their rooms for afternoon naps, seeking escape from the oppressive temperature, but sleep refused to come for me. The heat made my skin feel tight and itchy, and every breath felt like inhaling soup. My mother had gone to tend to her vegetable garden on the far side of the property, determined to salvage what she could from the drought-stressed plants. Through the window I could see her distant figure bent over the rows, a tiny speck against the vast backdrop of wilderness. The isolation of our cabin had never felt more pronounced than in that moment, surrounded by nothing but trees for miles in every direction. Boredom gnawed at me like hunger. I had already exhausted every book, every game, every form of entertainment available in the cabin. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the stifling air made me feel dizzy and claustrophobic. I needed to move, needed to breathe, needed to escape the suffocating confines of those four walls before I lost my mind entirely. The decision to venture into the woods came suddenly, born of desperation rather than desire. I pulled on my hiking boots, their leather already warm from the heat, and headed for the back door. The screen door groaned on its hinges as I pushed through, and immediately the wall of humid air hit me like a physical force. But even the oppressive outdoor heat felt better than the stagnant air inside. I could hear the distant drone of insects and the occasional crack of branches settling in the heat. The overgrown trail that led into our woods beckoned to me, its entrance marked by two massive oak trees whose trunks had grown together over the decades, forming a natural archway draped with hanging moss and twisted vines. As I stepped onto the trail, the temperature dropped noticeably. The canopy above was so dense that it filtered out most of the sun's rays, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the afternoon. The path beneath my feet was soft with decades of accumulated leaves and organic matter, creating a spongy carpet that muffled my footsteps. The deeper I ventured, the more the civilized world seemed to fall away. The sounds of the cabin and the distant highway faded until all I could hear was the rustle of leaves overhead and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. The trees grew larger and more ancient the further I walked, their massive trunks scarred by time and weather, their branches reaching across the trail like gnarled fingers trying to grasp something just out of reach. I had walked this trail hundreds of times before, but today something felt different. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, as if the very air was absorbing noise. Even my own breathing sounded strangely loud in the unnatural quiet. 20 minutes into my walk, I stopped dead in my tracks. A smell had reached my nostrils that made my stomach lurch violently. It was the unmistakable odor of decomposition, sweet and sickening, mixed with the earthy scent of mold and fungal growth. The stench was so powerful that it seemed to coat the inside of my mouth and throat, making me gag reflexively. I covered my nose and mouth with my shirt, but the smell penetrated even through the fabric. It was the kind of smell that triggered every primitive warning system in my brain, screaming that something was terribly wrong. Death had a distinctive odor, one that humans are hardwired to recognize and fear, and this was death magnified beyond anything I had ever encountered. My first thought was that a large animal had died somewhere nearby. Perhaps an elk or a moose had fallen victim to disease or old age, and was now decomposing in the underbrush. But as I stood there, trying to breathe through my mouth to avoid the worst of the stench, I realized the smell was far too intense for a single animal carcass. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, curiosity won out. I stepped off the main trail and began pushing through the dense undergrowth, following my nose toward the source of the horrific odor. Branches caught at my clothing and scratched my arms as I forced my way through the tangle of bushes and fallen logs. The smell grew stronger with each step, becoming so overwhelming that my eyes began to water. My stomach churned violently, and I had to stop several times to fight back waves of nausea. Whatever was causing this stench was something I had never encountered before, something that filled me with a deep, primal dread. I had pushed perhaps 50 feet off the main trail when I heard it. A voice clear as day, calling my name from somewhere deeper in the woods. But it wasn't just any voice. It was the unmistakable sound of my baby brother, barely 3 years old, his sweet, innocent voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. "Come here," the voice called, and my heart nearly stopped. "Come with me." Panic exploded in my chest like a physical blow. How could my brother be out here? He had been fast asleep when I left the cabin, exhausted from playing in the heat. Had he somehow awakened and wandered into these woods? The thought of that tiny child lost in this maze of trees and shadows made my legs feel weak with terror. I abandoned my search for the source of the smell and began crashing through the underbrush toward the voice, thorns tearing at my clothes and exposed skin. Every parent's worst nightmare was coming true, a small child lost in the wilderness, vulnerable to predators, exposure, and 1,000 other dangers. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." But as I pushed deeper into the woods, following the sound of that innocent voice, something began to feel wrong. The voice came again, still calling my name, but now I could hear that it was coming from a direction that would be impossible for a 3-year-old to reach. The terrain in that direction was treacherous, filled with steep ravines and dense tangles of thorny bushes that would be impassable for small legs. And there was something else about the voice that made the hair on my arms stand up, while it sounded exactly like my brother. There was an odd quality to it, as if it were coming from a great distance or being filtered through something that distorted its natural tone. I was perhaps 20 meters from where the voice seemed to be originating when I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The sound of something enormous moving through the forest, something far too large to be a toddler. Branches snapped like gunshots under immense weight, and I could hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of something that had to weigh hundreds of pounds. The sound was rhythmic and purposeful, not the random crashing of a panicked animal, but the measured movement of something that knew exactly where it was going. Whatever was making this noise was massive, larger than any bear or moose I had ever encountered in these woods. The very ground seemed to vibrate with each footfall. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. How could my brother's voice be coming from the same location as these terrifying sounds? Unless the realization hit me like a physical blow, and suddenly every horror story I had ever heard about people who disappeared in the wilderness came flooding back. Stories of predators who could mimic human voices, of dangerous individuals who lured victims deep into isolated areas where no one would ever find them. I stopped moving and crouched behind a large fallen log, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps continued, now seeming to circle my position, as if whatever was making them was trying to determine exactly where I was hiding. The voice came again, still using my brother's sweet, innocent tone. But now I could hear what I had missed before, a subtle wrongness in the inflection, a quality that no 3-year-old's voice should possess. It was my brother's voice, but it was being used by something that definitely was not my brother. "Come play with me," the false voice called again. And this time I could hear it was definitely closer. Whatever was out there was moving toward my hiding spot with deliberate intent. Terror gave way to pure survival instinct. I burst from my hiding place and began running back toward the main trail, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Branches whipped across my face and roots tried to trip me with every step, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me I could hear the massive footsteps increasing in pace. Whatever was pursuing me apparently no longer concerned with remaining hidden. The sound of my pursuer crashing through the underbrush filled the air behind me, a thunderous symphony of snapping branches and heavy impacts that seemed to shake the very trees around me. I could hear it gaining ground, its stride much longer than mine, its path through the forest more direct and efficient. My lungs burned as I gasped for air in the humid atmosphere, and sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes and making it difficult to see clearly. The path back to the main trail seemed endless, each tree looking identical to the last, making me question whether I was even heading in the right direction. The voice continued to call my name, but now it had dropped the pretense of my brother's innocent tone. There was something hungry in it now, something that made my skin crawl with revulsion. Whatever was behind that voice wanted something from me, and every instinct I possessed screamed that I never wanted to discover what that something was. I stumbled over a hidden root and went down hard, skinning my knees and palms on the rough ground. For a moment I lay there gasping, certain that whatever was chasing me would be on me in seconds. But as I scrambled back to my feet, I realized I could see the main trail just ahead through the trees. I burst onto the main trail and immediately turned toward home, my legs pumping with desperate energy. But my relief was short-lived, as I could still hear my pursuer crashing through the forest behind me, apparently unconcerned with staying hidden any longer. The sounds were terrifying in their intensity. Trees that would take me considerable effort to push aside seemed to offer no resistance to whatever was following me. I could hear massive branches snapping like twigs, and the heavy footfalls seemed to be gaining on me despite my desperate pace. The worst part was the voice, which continued to call my name with increasing frequency and volume. But now it was no longer just my brother's voice. I could hear my mother's voice mixed in, and even my own voice calling back to me. It was as if whatever was pursuing me could perfectly mimic any sound it had ever heard, and was using this ability to create a horrifying chorus that echoed through the trees. My legs felt like they were on fire, and my lungs burned with each ragged breath, but the terror of what was behind me drove me forward. I had run cross-country in high school, but I had never run like this, a full sprint fueled by pure adrenaline, and the absolute certainty that my life depended on reaching safety. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, each familiar landmark taking an eternity to reach. The old lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point, the creek crossing where the trail curved sharply to the left, the massive boulder that my father had always called the Sentinel. Each one passed in a blur of desperate motion and growing exhaustion. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit never wavered. If anything, they seemed to be getting closer, and I began to fear that whatever was chasing me would catch up before I could reach the safety of open ground. Just when I thought my legs would give out entirely, I saw the blessed sight of the forest's edge ahead. The trees began to thin, and I could see the open field that surrounded our cabin bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Never had sunlight looked so beautiful or promising. I burst from the tree line and immediately felt the oppressive weight of fear begin to lift from my shoulders. But I didn't slow down until I was 50 feet from the forest edge, finally daring to look back over my shoulder to see if my pursuer had followed me into the open. The forest stood silent and motionless, its dark interior revealing nothing of what lurked within. Whatever had been chasing me had stopped at the tree line, as if some invisible barrier prevented it from venturing into the open field. But I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows, and the sensation made my skin crawl with renewed dread. I stood there for several minutes, gasping for breath and waiting for my heart rate to return to something approaching normal. The contrast between the malevolent darkness of the forest and the peaceful serenity of the open field was so stark it was almost surreal. How could something so terrifying exist just yards away from such tranquil beauty? Finally, when I was certain nothing was going to emerge from the woods to continue the chase, I began walking across the field toward our cabin. With each step away from the forest, I felt safer, but the memory of what had happened continued to replay in my mind with vivid, horrifying clarity. When I reached the cabin, I went immediately to check on my baby brother. I found him exactly where I had left him, fast asleep in his bed, his tiny chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of innocent slumber. The sight of him safe and sound should have brought me relief, but instead it only confirmed what I already knew. Whatever had been calling to me in those woods had not been human. I never told my family what happened that day. How could I explain something that defied rational explanation? Instead, I carried the memory like a weight in my chest, a constant reminder that the world contains things that exist beyond our understanding, things that watch from the shadows and wait for the unwary to venture too far from safety. For weeks afterward, I avoided the woods entirely. Even now, years later, I never venture into those trees alone, and I never will again. Some experiences change you forever, and that day in the Manitoba woods taught me that there are voices in the darkness that should never be answered, no matter how familiar they might sound. The forest still calls to me sometimes, especially on quiet afternoons when the heat makes the air shimmer like water, but I have learned to resist its invitation, because I know now what waits in those green depths, patient and hungry, ready to lead the unwary deeper and deeper into places from which they might never return. I'm not sure if I'm ever going to fully understand what happened that winter at the old cabin in the Colorado Rockies. Afterwards, my wife and I decided to never go back. And that's saying a lot, as it had been in her family for decades. Normally, we'd all look forward to spending a week in the mountains, especially the kids. They'd get to run around in the snow and build snowmen, and just be away from school and chores for a while. But the year we went, when the blizzard hit, I swear something unexplainable happened that still gives me nightmares whenever I let my mind drift back to that cursed place. It all started when my wife Victoria said her dad needed someone to check on the old place. He was getting older, couldn't drive up there much anymore, and his arthritis was getting worse with each passing winter. The plan would be for us, myself, Victoria, and our 3 children, Isabella, who's 14, Gabriel, who's 11, and Samuel, who's 7, to head up for a long weekend in early February. We'd make sure the pipes weren't frozen, the place was in good shape, clear any dangerous snow accumulation from the roof, that kind of thing. At first I thought it would be a perfect getaway from the relentless pace of our lives in Seattle. I was looking forward to teaching the kids some winter survival tips, building an igloo, or at least a snow fort, showing them how to safely start a fire in the old wood stove. Victoria's father, George, had given us explicit instructions about the cabin's quirks. The main electrical breaker tended to trip if you ran too many appliances at once. The back door sometimes swelled in the humidity and needed a good shoulder to close properly. The ancient furnace made settling noises that could sound like footsteps if you weren't used to it. These seemed like normal old cabin problems. What he didn't mention, and what I learned later he'd been keeping from the family for years, was the darker history of the place. Built in 1962 by Victoria's grandfather, the cabin had seen its share of tragedy. A previous caretaker had died there under mysterious circumstances in the late 70s. A family of hikers had taken shelter there during a storm in the 80s, and reported strange occurrences that they never spoke of again in detail. But I knew none of this as we loaded up our SUV with enough supplies for 5 days. Victoria packed extra blankets, knowing the cabin's heating system was unreliable. I brought my toolbox and a battery-powered radio, figuring we might lose power. The kids packed board games, books, and Samuel insisted on bringing his favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Patches. The drive there started pleasantly enough on that gray Friday afternoon. We took Highway 70 west from Seattle, then wound our way up through increasingly remote mountain roads. The kids chatted excitedly in the back seat, playing word games and watching the scenery change from suburban neighborhoods to dense forests of pine and aspen. But as we climbed higher in elevation, the atmosphere began to shift in ways that went beyond the normal mountain weather patterns. The wind really picked up, howling through the trees with an intensity that made them sway and creak ominously. The snowfall started light, but grew heavier with each mile, transforming from gentle flakes to thick, wet clumps that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. By the time we reached the final turnoff onto the narrow gravel road leading to the cabin, we were basically crawling along in 4-wheel drive. The road, which I remembered as well maintained, was now rutted and icy, with snowdrifts that came up to the wheel wells in places. I had to stop twice to dig us out of particularly deep spots, my hands growing numb despite my insulated gloves. The kids had their faces pressed against the car windows, marveling at the giant flakes swirling around us like a living curtain of white. "Dad, it looks like we're inside a snow globe," Isabella exclaimed, and I told them, "Just wait till you're outside. You're going to feel like you're in a whole different world." We all laughed, but even then I noticed how the sound seemed muffled and strange, as if the mountain itself was absorbing our joy. Looking back, it was probably the last genuine laugh we had during the entire trip. The forest around us grew denser and darker as we climbed, the tall pines pressing in on both sides of the narrow road like ancient guards watching our passage. Several times I caught glimpses of what looked like eyes reflecting in our headlights. Probably deer or elk, I told myself, though they seemed to be watching us with an intelligence that felt unsettling. When we finally pulled up to the cabin after what felt like hours of treacherous driving, it felt oddly lifeless in a way that went beyond seasonal emptiness. I know that might sound silly. Of course it's lifeless if no one's been there for months, right? But there was something more to it, something that made my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. The cabin is a small 2-bedroom place with a loft, perched on a slight rise near a grove of towering pines. Usually I think it's charming, with its rustic log construction and green metal roof. But in the swirling gray-white of that late afternoon, with shadows stretching long and dark between the trees, the place looked decidedly ominous. The roof was bowed under the weight of accumulated snow, The windows were partially frosted over with ice crystals that looked like spider webs, and the front steps were slick with a layer of ice so thick it looked black. Victoria shivered as we stood looking at the place. And it wasn't just from the cold. "It looks different," she said quietly. And I knew exactly what she meant. The cabin seemed smaller somehow, hunched down against the storm like a frightened animal. The shadows around it appeared too deep, too dark, as if they were pools of something thicker than normal darkness. We hustled carefully inside, our boots crunching on the ice-covered porch boards. The front door, which I remembered as easy to open, stuck stubbornly and required several hard shoves before it finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty interior. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying an odd musty smell that I didn't remember from previous visits. I immediately set about cranking up the little furnace while Victoria found the main electrical panel and started flipping breakers. The kids explored the familiar rooms, their voices echoing strangely in the emptiness. "There's no television up there, just an old radio and a couple of board games stacked on a wooden shelf." Victoria set about making cocoa for the kids on the ancient gas stove, while I dragged in our suitcases and supplies from the car. The first thing that struck me as genuinely wrong happened almost immediately after we'd gotten settled. I noticed that the large wooden cross that had always hung near the fireplace was missing. In its place, where it had hung for as long as anyone could remember, there was now a small dark smudge on the wall, like something had been burned into the wood grain itself. The mark was roughly cross-shaped but twisted, as if the original had been heated until it left a permanent scar. I asked Victoria if her dad had taken the cross down for whatever reason, maybe to clean it or repair it. But she looked genuinely puzzled and worried. "He would never take that down," she said, her voice tight with concern. "You know how devout he is. That cross belonged to his father. It's been there since the cabin was built." When I examined the mark more closely, running my finger over the darkened wood, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like a mild electrical shock. The wood around the mark felt different too, warmer than it should have been, and slightly damp, as if something had been seeping through from behind the wall. I found myself reluctant to touch it again, though I couldn't articulate why. It really didn't make sense. Victoria tried calling her father on her cell phone, but we had no signal up here, which was normal. Still, the missing cross felt like more than just an odd coincidence. It felt like a warning we were too naive to understand. That evening, as we tried to settle into our temporary mountain routine, other small things began to feel off. The wind outside wasn't just strong, it seemed to have a pattern to it, a rhythm that sounded almost like whispered conversations. When I mentioned this to Victoria, she admitted she'd noticed it too, but we both tried to laugh it off as our city-dwelling imaginations running wild. The cabin's normal settling sounds seemed louder and more frequent than they should have been. Every few minutes we'd hear what sounded like footsteps in the loft above us, even when all three kids were downstairs. When I'd call up to check on them, they'd all be in the main room, reading or playing quietly. "Must be the house adjusting to having people in it again," I told Victoria, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. Samuel, our youngest, seemed particularly affected by the atmosphere. He kept looking over his shoulder and asking if we'd heard the man walking around upstairs. When we assured him it was just house sounds, he nodded but clutched his stuffed bear tighter and stayed close to Victoria's side. As night fell, the temperature dropped dramatically, and despite the furnace running constantly, the cabin never seemed to get truly warm. We could see our breath in some of the rooms, and ice began forming on the inside edges of the windows. I spent an hour checking for drafts and gaps in the insulation but found nothing that would account for the persistent chill. That night the snow kept coming down harder than I'd ever experienced in these mountains. We had dinner, canned soup and sandwiches, as we didn't trust the old oven yet, and sat around playing a card game called Crazy Eights with the kids. The atmosphere was mostly normal, filled with the usual family chatter and gentle arguments about game rules, except for the wind howling outside with an intensity that made the entire structure tremble. The cabin was old, built in the early 60s, but it had always seemed solid. Now, however, the windows began to rattle in their frames with each gust of wind, creating a rhythm that sounded disturbingly like Morse code. The front door, despite being securely locked, creaked and groaned as if someone was testing the handle from outside. Gabriel asked if we could check for leaks around the windows, so I did a thorough circuit around the cabin with a flashlight. The loft area appeared fine, no visible cracks in the windows or obvious air leaks, but I kept getting an intensely uncomfortable feeling in my gut, That uneasy sense you get when you're absolutely certain someone is watching you but you can't see them anywhere. Several times I spun around quickly thinking I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision, but found nothing except empty rooms and dancing shadows cast by my flashlight beam. The children's bedtime routine took longer than usual. Isabella and Gabriel both seemed reluctant to go up to the loft, making multiple trips downstairs for forgotten items or glasses of water. Samuel flat out refused to sleep anywhere but on the couch in the main room, claiming his bed felt wrong and that Mr. Patches didn't like it upstairs. Victoria and I eventually agreed to let him stay downstairs, figuring it was just adjustment anxiety to a new environment. Later that night, after we'd all supposedly gone to bed, I lay awake listening to the storm rage outside. Victoria was breathing deeply beside me, finally asleep after tossing and turning for hours. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard the strangest noise, a distant rhythmic banging sound like something heavy and persistent pounding on the walls outside. At first I assumed it was a branch slapping against the cabin in the wind, but as I listened more carefully, I realized the sound had a deliberate quality to it. 3 slow beats, then a pause. 3 more beats, another pause. It was too regular to be random, too purposeful to be caused by wind-blown debris. Along with the banging, I began to hear a different, deeper sound underneath a low moan or growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. It would start as barely audible, then gradually grow louder, then fade away, only to begin again a few minutes later. The sound raised the hair on my arms and neck, triggering some primal fear response that I couldn't rationalize away. I glanced over at Victoria, who was still sleeping deeply, and listened for sounds from the kids. Isabella and Gabriel seemed quiet up in the loft, and Samuel was presumably asleep on the couch. I decided to investigate alone, not wanting to wake anyone unnecessarily or alarm them if it turned out to be nothing. Pulling on my boots and heavy jacket, I grabbed the large flashlight we'd brought and quietly unlocked the front door. The second I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The snow was practically up to my knees, and the wind was ripping across the exposed porch with enough force to make me stagger. But even through the roar of the storm, I could clearly hear that low, rhythmic groaning. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees and the cabin walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. With my flashlight cutting a weak beam through the swirling snow, I did a careful walk around the entire perimeter of the cabin. I couldn't find any branches that might be hitting the walls. No loose shutters or siding that could account for the banging. No animals or people were visible anywhere, just the endless curtain of falling snow and the dark, swaying shapes of the pine trees surrounding us. But near the back of the cabin, on one of the old porch rail posts, I found deep gouges in the wood that made my blood freeze in my veins. They looked exactly like claw marks, but they were far too large and too deep to have been made by any normal mountain wildlife. We don't have bears in this particular area, at least not commonly, and these marks were spaced in a way that I'd never seen from any mountain lion or other predator I was familiar with. The gouges were fresh too. Bright wood showed through where the weathered exterior had been scraped away, and I could see wood shavings scattered in the snow below. Whatever had made these marks had been here recently, possibly even while we were inside having dinner. That was the first real wave of genuine fear I felt, a cold dread that settled in my stomach and refused to leave. I ended up going back inside, carefully locking all the doors and even pushing a couple of the heavy wooden chairs against them, just for my own peace of mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous, overreacting to what was probably just evidence of some large raccoon or maybe a bear passing through weeks ago. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was actively watching us, something that didn't want us here. I checked on Samuel, who was sleeping peacefully on the couch, and listened at the bottom of the loft stairs. The older kids seemed to be resting quietly. Victoria hadn't stirred when I came back in. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that my city-dweller nerves were just getting the better of me in an unfamiliar environment. The next morning I told Victoria about the strange sounds and the claw marks. She looked genuinely worried, her face pale in the gray morning light filtering through the frost-covered windows. "My dad never mentioned anything like that," she said, then tried to lighten the mood by adding, "Maybe what you heard was just the ghost of some old mountain man." But even as she smiled, I could tell she was deeply concerned. We spent most of that day trying to maintain normalcy, focusing on practical tasks. I shoveled snow away from the front door and cleared a path to where we'd parked the car, while Victoria organized our supplies and checked the cabin's emergency equipment. The kids built an impressive snowman in the small clearing in front of the cabin, their laughter echoing off the surrounding trees. I tried to bury my worries in routine maintenance tasks, stoking the fire, checking that the generator still worked, testing the backup propane tanks. I'd almost managed to convince myself that the claw marks could have been from some large raccoon, or maybe even a bear that had wandered through months ago before the heavy snows came. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the cabin began to feel increasingly oppressive. The temperature outside continued to drop, and despite our best efforts to keep the interior warm, a persistent chill seemed to seep through the walls. The kids complained of being cold even when they were bundled in multiple layers and sitting directly in front of the fireplace. More disturbing were the sounds that began to occur with increasing frequency throughout the day. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors that we'd left open mysteriously closing by themselves, the occasional creak from the loft that sounded exactly like someone walking across the floorboards, even when we could see all three children downstairs. Victoria and I began exchanging meaningful glances, the kind of wordless communication that married couples develop over years together. We were both feeling it, this growing sense that we were not alone in the cabin, that something else was sharing the space with us. But neither of us wanted to voice these fears in front of the children. Samuel, however, seemed most attuned to whatever was wrong. He refused to play alone in any room, insisted on having someone with him even when he went to the bathroom, and kept asking about the walking sounds that he heard coming from the walls themselves. When we asked him to describe what he meant, he said it sounded like someone was walking around inside the walls, between the rooms, going places that people weren't supposed to go. That evening, the real terror started in earnest. We were sitting around the main room after dinner, Victoria reading by the fireplace while I helped Gabriel with a jigsaw puzzle, and Isabella played a card game with Samuel. The atmosphere felt almost normal for the first time since we'd arrived, and I was beginning to think maybe we'd all just been on edge from the stress of the drive and the intensity of the storm. Then the lights began to flicker. Not just a brief dimming, but a deliberate on-off pattern that seemed to have intention behind it. That's not necessarily unusual for a cabin in the mountains during a snowstorm. Power fluctuations are common when trees fall on lines or transformers get overwhelmed. So I got up to check the circuit breaker panel, assuming we'd find a simple electrical problem. But every single breaker was in the correct position. No tripped switches, no signs of electrical problems. The main power line coming into the cabin appeared to be functioning normally, yet the lights continued their erratic flickering, creating an unsettling strobe effect that made the shadows in the room appear to dance and shift in unnatural ways. Right then, while I was still puzzling over the electrical issue, we heard a tremendous crash from the loft above us. The sound was so loud and sudden that Samuel screamed and dropped his cards, and even Isabella jumped to her feet in alarm. The kids shouted down that something had fallen, so I rushed up the narrow stairs to investigate. The scene that greeted me in the loft made no sense whatsoever. A heavy wooden shelf that had been securely mounted to the wall had somehow toppled completely off its brackets, scattering family photos, decorative knickknacks, and small keepsakes across the floor. Isabella was standing in the corner, visibly shaken, while Gabriel was helping Samuel pick up the scattered items. "It just fell," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "We were just sitting here talking, and it just came off the wall, like someone pushed it really hard from behind." I examined the wall brackets carefully. They weren't broken, bent, or loose. The screws were still tightly embedded in the solid log wall. There was no structural reason for the shelf to have failed, no vibration or settling that could account for such a sudden, complete collapse. The shelf itself was undamaged. It had simply been forcibly separated from brackets that should have held it securely in place. We cleaned up the scattered items, trying to keep the mood light and reassure the kids that it was probably just the cabin settling in the cold weather. But there was a tension that none of us could ignore, a feeling that the incident had been deliberate rather than accidental. The children huddled closer together on their makeshift beds, and I noticed they kept glancing nervously at the now empty wall where the shelf had been. Later, around 11 o'clock, after the kids had finally settled down for the night, Victoria and I were sitting quietly in the main room. She was trying to read by the flickering firelight, and I was flipping through an old magazine we'd found in the cabin, when the radio suddenly burst to life with deafening static. The sound was so sudden and loud that I nearly fell off my chair, and Victoria leaped to her feet, staring at the old radio as if it had transformed into something threatening. The volume was turned up to maximum, filling the entire cabin with harsh crackling noise that seemed to echo off every surface. I rushed over to the radio, fumbling with the volume knob and the power switch. But here's what made it truly terrifying. The radio wasn't plugged in. We had specifically unplugged that particular outlet earlier in the day to conserve electricity, and the cord was lying on the floor beside the table. Yet somehow the radio was receiving power and broadcasting that awful static at full volume. For just a moment, as I struggled to find the volume control in the flickering firelight, I swear I heard a voice cutting through the static. Not words exactly, but something that sounded like urgent whispering, like someone trying to communicate through the electronic interference. The sound made the hair on my arms stand on end and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. I finally managed to silence the radio by pulling the power cord completely away from the wall. But even then, it continued to crackle softly for another 10 or 15 seconds before finally going completely dead. The silence that followed felt almost more ominous than the static had been. Victoria was staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. It sounded like someone was trying to tell us something, like they were saying leave or get out. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak immediately. I had heard it too, and the voice had carried an urgency and desperation that suggested we were in immediate danger. Not even an hour later, our worst fears were confirmed in the most terrifying way possible. We heard a scream from the loft, not just a startled shout, but a genuine scream of absolute terror that made both Victoria and me spring to our feet and rush toward the stairs. We found all three children huddled together at the far end of the loft, pressed against the wall and pointing toward the corner near the stairs. Isabella was crying, Gabriel's face was completely drained of color, and Samuel was buried under his blankets with only his eyes visible, wide with fear. "There was someone there," Isabella stammered, her voice shaking so badly we could barely understand her. "A person, but not normal. They were tall and thin, and just standing there watching us. When we screamed, they just disappeared, like they melted into the shadows." Gabriel nodded frantically. It wasn't like a person walking away. They were there, and then they weren't, like they just became part of the darkness in the corner. I grabbed the flashlight and thoroughly searched every inch of the loft, looking behind furniture, checking the small storage spaces, examining the windows for any signs of entry. But that corner was completely empty, and there was no way anyone could have entered or exited the loft without using the stairs, which we would have seen. The children were too frightened to stay upstairs alone, so we all decided to sleep together in the main room downstairs. I moved the couch and chairs to create a more open space, and we piled every blanket and pillow we could find into a makeshift campsite near the fireplace. Victoria and I took turns staying awake, sitting up and watching the room while the other dozed fitfully. Around 3 in the morning, during my watch, I heard the banging again. But this time it wasn't coming from outside the cabin. It was definitely coming from inside the walls, as if someone was walking around in the spaces between the rooms, moving through areas where no human could possibly fit. The sound would start in one wall, then gradually move along the length of the room, then shift to an adjacent wall, as if something was systematically exploring the interior structure of the cabin. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, other times like dragging or scraping, as if something heavy was being pulled across the wooden framework inside the walls. I got up with my flashlight and quietly made my way through the cabin, trying to follow the sounds. Every few minutes I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape that seemed to flow rather than walk, always just at the edge of my vision, and always gone when I turned to look directly at it. Twice I even spun around quickly with the flashlight beam, certain I'd catch sight of whatever was sharing the cabin with us, only to find nothing but empty rooms and normal shadows. But the sense of being observed never left me. If anything, it grew stronger, as if our invisible visitor was becoming bolder, more comfortable with our presence. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. My stomach was constantly twisted with anxiety, my heart rate elevated, my hands shaking slightly from the constant state of alertness. Victoria was experiencing the same symptoms. We were both operating on pure adrenaline and fear. But it was the effect on the children that finally convinced me we had to leave. Samuel had stopped talking except in whispers, and only when directly questioned. Isabella was jumpy and fearful, starting at every small sound. Gabriel was trying to be brave, but I could see the strain in his face, the dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. Whatever was in that cabin with us, whether supernatural entity, psychological manifestation, or something else entirely, it was having a profound and negative effect on my family's well-being. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find logical explanations, but the protective father in me knew that we were in a situation that could become genuinely dangerous. Finally, sometime just before dawn on our third day, when the storm showed the first signs of easing, I made the decision that probably saved our sanity, if not our lives. I woke Victoria quietly and told her we were leaving immediately. She didn't argue. If anything, she looked relieved that I'd finally voiced what we were both thinking. We roused the children and explained that we were going to pack up and head home early because of the weather conditions. They were all too eager to leave, and for the first time in days, I saw genuine smiles on their faces. Even Samuel emerged from his frightened silence to ask if we could go home now and never come back. We gathered our belongings in record time, throwing everything into suitcases and bags with none of the careful organization we'd used when packing. The atmosphere in the cabin felt different as we prepared to leave, heavier somehow, as if whatever presence we'd been sharing the space with was aware of our intentions and was not pleased. The wind had died down enough that driving was feasible, even if it meant tackling some treacherous mountain roads. We loaded the car quickly, everyone eager to get away from the cabin and back to the safety of civilization. As I carried the last bag to the car, I made the mistake of looking back at the cabin one final time. Standing in the front window, clearly visible in the gray morning light, was a tall, thin figure. It appeared to be human in general shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too angular, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. Most disturbing were its eyes, which seemed to glow with their own light, reflecting the dawn like an animal's eyes, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and hostile. The figure didn't move, didn't gesture, didn't try to follow us. It simply stood there watching as we loaded our car and prepared to leave, its glowing eyes tracking our movements with predatory attention. I slammed the car door shut without saying anything to the family about what I'd seen, my heart racing and my hands trembling as I started the engine. We barely made it down the mountain, sliding around on the icy roads and navigating through snowdrifts that had grown even deeper overnight. But I felt an immense sense of relief once we reached the main highway and put some distance between us and that cursed place. The kids seemed to relax visibly as the miles passed, and by the time we reached the outskirts of Seattle, the oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded us for 3 days was finally beginning to lift. Later, when we'd had time to process what had happened, Victoria and I told her father about the strange events, the missing cross, the electrical problems, the shelf collapse, the radio incident, the banging in the walls, the figure the children had seen, and my final glimpse of something standing in the window. He listened quietly, his face growing paler with each detail, his hands developing a noticeable tremor. He never said he believed us outright, but I could see the recognition in his eyes, as if our story was confirming fears he'd harbored for years. Eventually, he admitted that his own father had experienced something evil in the cabin decades earlier, something that had made the old man reluctant to spend time there alone. It's been several years now since that terrifying weekend, and we haven't returned to the cabin, not even for a day trip. The kids don't ask about it anymore, though I sometimes catch them looking thoughtful when we drive past the turnoff to that mountain road. We've found other places to vacation, other mountains to explore, but none of us has forgotten what we experienced in that isolated cabin. I still wonder sometimes about the true nature of what we encountered. Was it some kind of residual energy from past tragedies, a psychological manifestation brought on by isolation and stress? Or was there actually something malevolent inhabiting that remote mountain cabin, something that fed on fear and wanted living people to leave its territory? The rational part of my mind continues to search for logical explanations. Carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace, infrasound from the wind causing hallucinations, mass hysteria triggered by the stress of the storm. But every time I recall that final moment, seeing that impossibly tall figure standing motionless in the window, I know that some experiences transcend rational explanation. Whatever we encountered in that cabin was real, at least in terms of its effect on our family. It wanted us gone, and it got what it wanted. As far as I'm concerned, that cabin can remain empty forever. The mountain can keep its secrets, and we'll find our peace elsewhere. I hope anyone else who might consider staying there is better prepared than we were for what they might find lurking in the darkness between the walls. Because once you've experienced something like that, Once you've felt the presence of something that exists outside normal human understanding, your sense of safety in the world is never quite the same again. Some places are simply not meant for the living, and that cabin high in the Colorado Rockies is definitely one of them. May God protect anyone who doesn't heed this warning. I never really bought into all that paranormal stuff. My name's Otis Drexel, and I've been working in the missing persons unit for a good chunk of my life. 23 years to be exact. My job is to find people who seem to have vanished off the face of the earth. Most times it's just folks getting lost, having accidents, or sadly deciding to disappear on their own. But this one case, it still doesn't sit right with me. It was a Friday, I think. May 15th, 2022. The kind of spring morning where the air still has a bite to it, reminding you that summer isn't quite ready to take over yet. I was at my desk, sipping my third cup of coffee and reviewing some case files when my phone rang. Drexel, I answered, my voice still gravelly from lack of sleep. Detective Drexel, this is Ranger Johnson from Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've got a situation here that might require your expertise. I sat up straighter, my interest piqued. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a popular spot, but also vast and wild enough to swallow a person whole. We'd had our fair share of cases there over the years. What's the situation, Ranger? We've got a missing camper. Rachel Pollard, 28 years old. Her boyfriend reported her missing early this morning. Says they had a fight last night, and she stormed off. When he went looking for her hours later, there was no trace. I jotted down the details in my notebook, my mind already racing through the possibilities. Any signs of foul play? None that we can see, but we haven't done a thorough search yet. The boyfriend seems pretty shaken up. I glanced at my watch. 10:46 a.m. All right, I'm on my way. Keep the boyfriend there, and don't let anyone contaminate the scene. I hung up, grabbed my jacket, and headed out. As I drove towards the park, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the dense trees and rolling hills. The air was crisp with that unique smell of pine and earth you only get in places like this. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease settling in my gut. I arrived at the park ranger station just after noon. Ranger Johnson met me at the entrance, a tall, weathered man with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. Detective Drexel, he greeted me with a firm handshake. Thanks for coming so quickly. The boyfriend's inside. Name's Mark Henson. He's pretty worked up. I nodded, following Johnson into the station. In the small waiting area sat a scrawny guy with a guilty look on his face. He was pale and jittery, which wasn't unusual for someone whose loved one was missing, but something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. Mr. Henson. I approached him, flashing my badge. I'm Detective Otis Drexel. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Rachel's disappearance. Mark looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. Yeah, okay. Whatever helps find her. I sat down across from him, pulling out my notebook. Walk me through what happened last night. You said you had an argument. Mark nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair.
Yeah, we've been having some problems lately. Rachel's been distant, you know?
Last night I confronted her about it. Things got heated. What time was this? Around 9 p.m., I think. We'd just finished dinner at our campsite. I jotted this down. And then what happened? Mark's voice trembled slightly as he continued. We argued. Yeah, she was really upset. She said she needed space, and then she just walked into the woods. I thought she'd cool off and come back, but she didn't. I looked for hours, but it's like she just disappeared. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. Anyone else around? Anything unusual you noticed? Mark shook his head. Just us. We didn't see anyone. Our campsite is pretty isolated. What was Rachel wearing when she left? Jeans, hiking boots, and a red fleece jacket. She had her phone with her, but it's going straight to voicemail now. I made a note of the description. And you waited until this morning to report her missing. Mark's eyes darted away from mine. I thought she'd come back. I kept looking for her all night. When she didn't show up by dawn, I hiked back to get help. Something about his story didn't quite add up, but I couldn't put my finger on what. I'd seen enough cases to know that the person closest to the victim is often involved. but I'd also seen enough to know that sometimes terrible things just happen. All right, Mr. Henson. We're going to do everything we can to find Rachel. I need you to stay here at the station in case we have any more questions. Can you do that? He nodded, looking relieved to be done with the interview for now. I stepped outside with Ranger Johnson, the cool air a welcome relief after the stuffy interior of the station. What do you think? Johnson asked, his eyes scanning the tree line as if Rachel might suddenly appear. Hard to say at this point, I replied. His story seemed shaky, but that could just be stress. We need to get a search team out there ASAP. The first 48 hours are crucial in these cases. Johnson nodded. I've already called in some extra rangers. We can be ready to go in 30 minutes. Good. Let's get moving. As we prepared for the search, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something. Little did I know, this case was about to take me down a path I never expected, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The search team assembled quickly, a mix of park rangers, local law enforcement, and volunteers. I went over the map with them, marking out the area where Rachel was last seen. Her campsite was located in a less frequented part of the park, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest road. Remember? I addressed the group. We're looking for any signs of Rachel Pollard. Clothing, personal items, tracks, anything out of the ordinary. If you find something, don't touch it. Mark the location and radio it in immediately. We spread out, each team taking a different section of the search grid. I paired up with Ranger Johnson, heading towards the area where Mark claimed Rachel had walked off. You'd be amazed at how quickly a person can vanish in the wilderness. The dense foliage and winding trails make it a real maze. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the canopy above grew thicker, casting long shadows across our path. How often do you get missing persons cases out here? I asked Johnson as we carefully scanned the ground for any signs of disturbance. More often than we'd like, he replied, his voice low. Most of the time it's just hikers who've gotten turned around. We find them within a day or two, dehydrated and scared, but alive. And the other times, Johnson's face darkened. Sometimes we don't find them at all. The forest, it can be unforgiving. We continued in silence after that, the weight of his words hanging in the air between us. Hours passed and we found nothing. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing to indicate Rachel had ever been there. As the afternoon wore on, I met up with 2 other rangers, Ted and Lisa, who had been searching a particularly thick part of the forest. Anything? I asked, hoping for a lead. Nothing, Otis, Lisa replied, wiping sweat from her brow. It's like she vanished into thin air. We decided to take a break and regroup. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. It's something you get used to in my line of work, but it doesn't mean it's not unsettling. The stillness can play tricks on your mind. As we sat there catching our breath and comparing notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But there was never anything there, just trees and shadows. We should head back soon, Johnson said, checking his watch. It'll be dark in a couple of hours. I nodded, but I was reluctant to give up. Something about this case had gotten under my skin. Let's do one more sweep. There's a small trail over there that we haven't checked yet. The others agreed, and we set off towards the narrow path I'd spotted. It was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it drew me in. As we made our way down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the fading sunlight. The air grew cooler, and the silence more pronounced. It felt like stepping into another world. We were about half a mile in when I saw something strange. A clearing up ahead, bathed in an eerie light that seemed out of place in the dense forest. I held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. Do you see that? I whispered, pointing towards the unnatural glow. Johnson squinted, then nodded. What the hell is that? Carefully, we approached the edge of the clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, ancient-looking and covered in moss. And in the middle of that circle, oh my God, Lisa gasped. There, sprawled out in the center of the stone circle, was Rachel Pollard. Her eyes were open but lifeless, her body unnaturally twisted. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries. She was just dead. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. As I knelt beside her to check for any signs of life, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the silence. "Damn it," I muttered, my nerves on edge. I reached for my radio to call it in, but as I did, I noticed something clutched in Rachel's hand. It was a small, smooth stone, unlike any I'd seen in the area. There was something etched into its surface, but I couldn't make it out in the fading light. As I pocketed the stone, intending to examine it more closely later, the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The forest had revealed one secret, but it was holding on to many more. And as the sun set on that first day of the investigation, I had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, or how it would change everything I thought I knew about the world. We secured the area and began the process of documenting the scene. As we worked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking just out of sight. But there was never anything there, just the endless expanse of trees and the growing darkness. The medical examiner arrived about an hour later, looking as unsettled as the rest of us. Dr. Maria Suarez, a seasoned professional I'd worked with on numerous cases, knelt beside Rachel's body, her face a mask of concentration. "What do you think, Doc?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up at me, her brow furrowed. "I can't say for certain without a full autopsy, but there's no apparent cause of death. No marks, no wounds, nothing. It's as if she just stopped living." A chill ran down my spine at her words. In all my years on the job, I'd never encountered anything like this. We were packing up to leave when Ted called out, "Otis, over here. You need to see this." I walked over to where he was standing, just outside the clearing. There, partially hidden under a fallen tree, was another body. This one was older, much older. The clothes were tattered, and the remains skeletal. "This just keeps getting better," I said, sarcasm masking my unease. The discovery of the second body changed everything. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was something much darker. We called in more teams, and soon the area was swarming with personnel. The skeletal remains were carefully excavated and sent to the lab for analysis. As night fell, the park took on an even more sinister tone. The rangers set up a perimeter, and we camped out, unwilling to leave the scene unattended. I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions and theories. What had happened to Rachel? And what about the old remains? It didn't make sense. People don't just die for no reason. Around midnight, as I sat by the campfire, I heard a low, almost inaudible hum. It seemed to come from all around us, reverberating through the trees. I looked at Ted and Lisa, but they were deep in conversation, oblivious to the sound. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and walked towards the edge of the clearing. The hum grew louder, more insistent. I shone the light into the woods, half expecting to see something watching me, but there was nothing. "Everything okay, Otis?" Johnson's voice made me jump. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I replied, trying to sound casual. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling of unease never left. By morning, we were all eager to get back to the main station and report our findings. As we packed up, I remembered the strange stone I'd found in Rachel's hand. I pulled it out of my pocket, turning it over in the morning light. The etching was clearer now, but I still couldn't make sense of it. It looked like some kind of symbol, ancient and worn.
Hey, Ted, take a look at this.
I called out. He walked over, squinting at the stone. "What do you think it is?" "No idea, but it feels out of place," I said, pocketing the stone again. "Let's get it back to the lab, see if they can make anything of it." We made our way back to the park's main office, the events of the past day weighing heavily on us. Rachel's body was taken to the morgue, and the skeletal remains were sent for further analysis. I handed the stone over to our forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. As I sat down to write up my preliminary report, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were just scratching the surface of something much bigger. The forest had given up 2 of its secrets, but I had a sinking feeling there were many more to uncover. Days turned into weeks, and the case only grew stranger. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death for Rachel. Her body showed no signs of trauma, no evidence of drug use. Nothing to explain why a healthy 28-year-old woman would suddenly drop dead in the middle of the forest. The skeletal remains were identified as belonging to a hiker who had gone missing over a decade ago. His case had gone cold, written off as another unfortunate soul lost to the wilderness. But now, finding him in the same spot as Rachel, it seemed like too much of a coincidence. And then there was the stone. Our forensics team couldn't make heads or tails of it. It wasn't from any local geology, and the markings didn't match any known language or symbols. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, just like our victims had vanished. I spent countless hours poring over old case files, looking for any connections. And then I found it, a series of disappearances dating back decades, all in the same area of the park, all unsolved, all with no trace of the missing persons ever found. One night, as I was going over the files for what felt like the 100th time, my phone rang. It was Lisa, one of the rangers who had been with me when we found Rachel. "Otis," her voice was shaky. "You need to come to the park, now." I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my coat and drove out to the park, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale in the harsh glare of the parking lot lights. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just follow me," she said, leading me into the woods. We walked in silence, the darkness pressing in around us. The familiar hum I'd heard that first night seemed to grow louder with each step. Lisa led me to the same clearing where we'd found Rachel. In the center was another circle of stones, and in the middle, another body. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The body was that of a man, his face contorted in a look of sheer terror. He was dressed in hiking gear, and from the looks of it, he hadn't been dead long. "We found him this morning," Lisa said quietly. "No ID, no belongings, just—" I knelt beside the body, examining it closely. There were no visible injuries, just like Rachel, but this time, there was something different. In the man's hand was a piece of paper, tightly clenched. I pried it loose, my hands trembling. The paper was old and worn, but the writing was clear. It was a map with the clearing marked in red, and beneath it, a single word: beware. I stood up, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? I looked around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We made our way back to the main office, the weight of the new discovery heavy on our shoulders. I handed the map over to the forensics team, hoping it would provide some answers. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The new body was identified as another missing hiker. His case also long cold. The map was examined, but it didn't match any known trails or landmarks. It was as if it was drawn by someone who knew the forest intimately, but not in any official capacity. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. Something ancient and malevolent. The stone, the bodies, the map, they were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. It was during a late-night research session that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. An old journal, buried deep in the park's archives, written by one of the original surveyors of the area in the late 1800s. The journal spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, unexplained disappearances, eerie sounds, and most disturbingly, a clearing with a circle of stones that seemed to appear and disappear at will. The surveyor wrote of a local Cherokee legend about a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place where dark spirits could cross over and take the unwary. The description matched our clearing perfectly. I knew then that we were dealing with something beyond the realm of normal police work. But I also knew that I couldn't just walk away. Too many people had vanished. Too many families were left without answers. I gathered a team of trusted colleagues, including Ted and Lisa, and we set out for the clearing once more. This time we were prepared, or so we thought. We had cameras, recording equipment, and enough supplies to last days. As we entered the clearing, the air grew heavy with tension. We set up our equipment, documenting everything meticulously. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The forest was silent, almost unnaturally so. And then, just as the sun began to set, we heard it. The low hum, growing louder and more insistent. We looked around, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the darkness closing in. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The stones in the circle glowed with an eerie light, casting strange shadows on the trees. And then, in the center of the circle, a figure appeared. It was tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved with an eerie grace, its limbs long and thin. It looked at us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, and the ground beneath us began to crack. We stumbled back, trying to keep our footing. "Otis, what do we do?" Lisa shouted, her voice filled with fear. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing her arm. We ran, the ground cracking and shaking beneath us. The hum grew louder, almost deafening. I glanced back and saw the figure watching us, its eyes glowing brighter. We burst out of the clearing and into the forest, the ground still trembling. We didn't stop running until we reached the main office, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling. We reported everything, but no one believed us. The footage we recorded was mysteriously corrupted. The maps we found were dismissed as hoaxes. It was as if the forest itself was hiding the truth. Rachel's case remained unsolved, her death a mystery. The old remains in the new body were buried, their stories forgotten, but I knew there was something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent. In the months that followed, I tried to move on, to focus on other cases, but the events of that day haunted me. The forest had taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I still have the stone, a small, smooth reminder of the unknown, and sometimes late at night I can still hear that low, insistent hum echoing through the silence. The Great Smoky Mountains keep their secrets well, but for those who know where to look, the signs are there. A warning to the curious, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that there are things in this world that defy explanation. But I can't help but wonder, as I look out at the distant mountains, how many more souls the forest will claim before its hunger is satisfied. Spring 1998. The crisp, damp air of the Pacific Northwest filled my lungs as I stepped out of my old pickup truck. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth brought back a flood of memories. Childhood hunting trips with my father, lazy summer afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, and the comforting warmth of the cabin's fireplace on cold winter nights. I'm Wyatt, and this little slice of wilderness has been a part of my family for 3 generations. The cabin, tucked deep in the heart of Olympic National Forest, was my grandfather's pride and joy. He'd built it with his own hands back in the 50s, a testament to his craftsmanship and love for these woods. Now, as I stood there in the fading light of a spring evening, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of melancholy. The cabin was showing its age. The porch sagged slightly, its wooden boards soft with rot in places. The roof had sprung a few leaks during the last winter, and the whole structure seemed to lean ever so slightly to one side, as if tired after decades of standing sentinel in these woods. That's why I was here. A week of repairs and maintenance, getting the old place ready for the fall elk season. It wasn't much, but it was a connection to my past, a link to the men who'd shaped me. And if I'm being honest, it was a much-needed escape from the grind of city life. I unloaded my tools and supplies, stacking them neatly on the porch. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant call of a bird I couldn't identify. As I worked, I found myself relaxing, the tension of the long drive and weeks of city stress melting away with each swing of the hammer, each board I replaced. That first night, I sat on the newly repaired porch, nursing a beer and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the small fire I'd built in the pit out front. It was in moments like these that I understood why my grandfather had chosen this spot, why my father had continued the tradition, and why I felt so drawn to it still. Little did I know that this peaceful evening was the calm before a storm that would change my life forever. The next few days passed in a blur of physical labor. I replaced rotting boards, patched leaks, and generally tried to breathe new life into the old cabin. It was satisfying work, the kind that leaves you bone-tired but content at the end of each day. It was on the 4th day that everything changed. I'd been working down by the creek, cutting new boards to replace some of the worst on the porch. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The steady buzz of my chainsaw filled the air, drowning out the usual forest sounds. That's when I heard it. A sound like branches snapping, but heavier, more deliberate. At first, I didn't think much of it. These woods were home to plenty of deer, and the occasional black bear wasn't unheard of. I kept working, focused on the task at hand. But then I heard it again, closer this time, and something else. A low, rough growling sound that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not in all my years of roaming these woods. I switched off the chainsaw, the sudden silence almost deafening. Slowly I turned, my eyes scanning the tree line. What emerged from the shadows wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It was something else entirely. The creature stood a good head taller than me, even hunched over as it was. Its body was lean, almost emaciated with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. Patchy fur covered its body, dark in most places but streaked here and there with an unsettling blood-red color. Its head was what struck me the most. The skull seemed almost too small for its massive body, with a muzzle stretched long like a wolf's. But the eyes, God, those eyes. They were yellow, slitted like a cat's, and filled with a hatred so intense it froze me in place. For a moment we just stared at each other. Me, rooted to the spot with terror. The creature, its chest heaving with each breath, drool running from a mouth filled with jagged, mismatched teeth. Then it roared. The sound ripped through the air, a primal scream of rage and hunger that shook me to my core. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling to find something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a fallen log about 5 feet thick, old-growth timber that had probably lain there for decades. Without thinking, I turned and ran for it, hearing the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. I vaulted onto the log, rolling over to the other side just as I felt the wind of the creature's claws swiping at the space where I'd been seconds before. I pressed my back against the rough bark, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. For what felt like an eternity, we were at a stalemate. I was trapped on one side of the log, the creature circling on the other, its yellow eyes never leaving me, drool dripping onto the moss below. I looked around wildly, desperate for anything I could use to defend myself. That's when I saw it, the chainsaw, lying where I dropped it in my panic. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was a moment of insanity brought on by fear. But in that instant, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I leapt from the log, one eye on the creature, the other on the saw. The beast tensed, ready to charge the moment I moved. But somehow, I made it. I snatched up the saw, yanked the cord, and the engine roared to life. I turned to face the monster, the buzzing saw held out in front of me, like a shield. The creature hesitated, backing up a step, then another. Whether it was startled by the sudden noise or genuinely afraid of the blade, I couldn't say, but it gave me an opening. Slowly, I started edging backwards towards the cabin. If I could make it inside, I had my rifle. Maybe that would be enough to drive this thing away for good. I made it about 10 feet before the creature made its move. With a burst of speed that took me completely by surprise, it lunged forward. Instinctively, I swung the saw. The sound of the blade biting into flesh and bone was sickening. Dark blood splattered the leaves as the creature howled in pain, one of its arms hanging limp, nearly severed at the shoulder. For a moment our eyes met again. In that instant I saw something in those yellow depths that chilled me even more than the hatred had. Intelligence. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. There was a mind behind those eyes, alien and terrifying. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and bolted back into the woods, leaving nothing but a trail of blood and broken undergrowth in its wake. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, the chainsaw still buzzing in my hands. When I finally managed to switch it off, the silence of the forest seemed to close in around me, oppressive and filled with unseen threats. Somehow, I made it back to the cabin. I patched up the few scratches I'd received as best I could, my hands trembling the entire time. That night I sat up with my rifle across my lap, jumping at every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of wind in the trees outside. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, I made a decision. I had to go back for the chainsaw. It felt wrong to just leave it out there. and some irrational part of my mind was terrified of someone else finding it, of having to explain the blood. I waited until full daylight, then ventured out with my rifle in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I found the saw lying in a pool of congealed blood, dark and tacky in the morning sun. I cleaned it as best I could, trying not to retch at the smell and the memory of what had happened. I didn't see the creature again that trip, but every night I lay awake listening, wondering if it was out there, nursing its wounds, waiting. When I finally left a few days later, it was with a sense of relief so profound it was almost painful. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the receding tree line. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flash of yellow eyes watching me go, but that had to be my imagination, right? The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and jumpy days. I'd returned to my apartment in the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide those yellow eyes. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. I told no one about what had happened. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I'd lived through it. I was sure that if I opened my mouth, I'd be met with either laughter or concerned looks and suggestions of therapy. But I couldn't let it go. The image of that creature, its inhuman eyes, the sound of its roar, they haunted me. I started doing research, spending hours online and in libraries, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Most of what I found was useless. Cryptozoology websites full of blurry photos and secondhand accounts, conspiracy theories that ranged from the absurd to the terrifying. But here and there, I'd find something that made my blood run cold. A Native American legend about a creature that stalked the forests of the Pacific Northwest. An account from an early settler describing a demon beast with yellow eyes and an insatiable hunger. Nothing matched exactly what I'd seen, but there were enough similarities to keep me digging. I became obsessed, neglecting my work, my friends, even my health in my quest for answers. It was during one of these research binges that I stumbled upon it. A dusty leather-bound book in a tiny used bookstore downtown. The Cryptids of the Pacific Northwest, the gold-embossed title proclaimed. I bought it without hesitation, hurrying home to devour its contents. Most of the book was what I'd come to expect. Bigfoot sightings, sea serpent tales. The usual fare for this kind of literature. But near the back, in a chapter on monstrous predators, I found something that made my heart stop. The Wendigo. The description wasn't an exact match for what I'd encountered, but it was close, too close to be coincidence. An emaciated body with unnaturally long limbs, a head that seemed too small, with a muzzle like a wolf's, and those eyes, yellow, filled with an insatiable hunger. The book spoke of the Wendigo as a creature of insatiable appetite, driven by an eternal hunger for human flesh. It was said to be created when a person resorted to cannibalism, transformed by their heinous act into a monster that could never be satisfied. As I read, memories of that day by the creek came flooding back. The raw animalistic hunger I'd seen in those eyes, the intelligence behind them, the way it had hesitated when confronted with the chainsaw, showing a level of reasoning beyond that of a simple beast. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of coincidence, my mind making connections that weren't there. And yet, I never went back to the cabin after that. I told myself it was because I was too busy, that I'd outgrown the need for that kind of solitude. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was afraid. Afraid that every rustle in the wind, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, would be that creature returning. I sold the cabin a few years later, told myself it was time to let go of the past, to move on. But even as I signed the papers, I felt a twinge of guilt. Was I abandoning my responsibility, leaving others vulnerable to whatever was out there in those woods? The years passed. I tried to move on, to forget, but every now and then, something would happen that would bring it all rushing back. A news story about a missing hiker in the Olympics, a hunter who vanished without a trace, or worst of all, reports of mutilated animal carcasses that authorities couldn't explain. Each time, the nightmares would start again. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman roar ringing in my ears, the memory of those yellow eyes burning in my mind. I told myself it was over, that I'd escaped, that the creature, whether it was truly a Wendigo or something else entirely, was gone. But deep down, in the darkest corners of my mind, A voice whispered that it wasn't over, that someday, somehow, our paths would cross again. And when that day came, I didn't know if I'd be ready. 20 years. That's how long it had been since that day in the woods. 20 years of trying to forget, of building a new life, far from the shadows of the Olympic National Forest. I'd moved to the East Coast, thrown myself into my work, done everything I could to put the past behind me. But you can't outrun your demons forever. It was a Tuesday when the letter arrived. Just a simple envelope, unremarkable except for the return address. A P.O. box in a small town not far from where my old cabin had stood. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even after all these years. Ethan, my old neighbor from up near the cabin. We hadn't spoken since I'd sold the place, had barely kept in touch even before that, but there was an urgency to his scrawled words that set alarm bells ringing in my head. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began to read. While I hope this letter finds you well. I know it's been a long time, and I'm sorry to bother you out of the blue like this, but something's happening up here, something I can't explain, and I don't know who else to turn to. It started a few months ago. Livestock going missing, then turning up torn apart in ways that don't make sense. My neighbor's dog disappeared, then showed up on their porch the next day, half-eaten, and the sounds, Wyatt. The sounds in the woods at night. I know how this must sound, but I remember the stories you used to tell, the things you said you saw that summer before you left. I didn't believe you then. I'm sorry for that. But now I think I understand.
Please, Wyatt. I need your help. Something's out there, something that shouldn't exist, and I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before it comes for us.
Ethan, I stood there in my kitchen, the letter shaking in my hands. Memories I'd spent 2 decades trying to bury coming rushing back. Part of me wanted to crumple the paper, toss it in the trash, and pretend I'd never read those words. To tell myself that Ethan was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for everything he'd described. But another part of me, a part I'd tried so hard to silence over the years, knew better. I remembered the promise I'd made to myself in those sleepless nights after my encounter. If I ever saw evidence, real evidence, that the creature was back, I wouldn't run, I wouldn't hide. I'd hunt it down. With a sigh that felt like it came from the depths of my soul, I reached for my phone. It was time to book a flight back to Washington, back to the forests that had haunted my nightmares for 20 years, back to face the Wendigo. The flight to Seattle felt like it took an eternity. Every mile that brought me closer to the Olympic Peninsula seemed to wind the tension in my gut tighter. I'd packed light, some clothes, basic supplies, and my old hunting rifle. I'd had to jump through some hoops to bring it on the plane, but there was no way I was heading back into those woods unarmed. As I drove the winding roads towards Ethan's place, memories flooded back. The smell of pine and damp earth, the way the mist clung to the trees in the early morning. And always, the memory of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. Ethan was waiting for me when I pulled up. He looked older, worn down by worry. The easy smile I remembered was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. We didn't hug, didn't trade jokes. There was no time for that, not with the creeping dread that seemed to hang over both of us like a shroud. "Thanks for coming, Wyatt," Ethan said, his voice low and gravelly. "I wasn't sure you would." I nodded, shouldering my bag. Wasn't sure I would either, but here I am. We went inside, and over cups of coffee that grew cold and forgotten, Ethan filled me in on what had been happening. The stories were chilling. Livestock torn apart, pets disappearing, strange tracks found in the mud that didn't match any known animal, and always, the sounds in the night. Howls that were almost human but twisted into something terrible. "I thought I was going crazy," Ethan admitted, his hands shaking slightly as he set down his mug. "But then I remembered the things you used to talk about. The creature you said you saw." I closed my eyes, fighting back the flood of memories. "I hoped I'd never have to think about that again," I said softly. "But I guess some things don't stay buried." As night fell, we made our plans. In the morning, Ethan would take me to the places where the worst incidents had happened. We'd look for signs, try to piece together what was going on. And then, well, we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. That night, as I lay on Ethan's couch trying to sleep, I could hear the wind howling outside. And in that wind, I could have sworn I heard something else. A cry of hunger, a promise of violence to come. The hunt had begun. Dawn broke cold and misty over the forest. Ethan and I set out early, our breath fogging in the chill air. He led me to the first site, a clearing where one of his neighbor's cows had been found, or what was left of it. The grass was still matted and stained dark in places, despite the weeks that had passed. I crouched down, examining the ground closely. There were tracks, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Too large for a wolf or a bear, with claw marks that gouged deep into the earth. Jesus, I muttered, running my fingers along the edge of one print. What could have done this? Ethan just shook his head, his face pale. That's not even the worst of it. Come on. We spent the rest of the morning moving from site to site. Each one told the same story. Violence beyond anything natural predators were capable of. At the last stop, the site of a hunter's abandoned campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. Caught on a low-hanging branch was a tuft of fur. Dark, almost black, but streaked through with that sickening blood-red color I remembered all too well. Ethan, I called, my voice shaking slightly. I think we have a problem. I showed him the fur, explained what it meant. His face went ashen. So it's real, he whispered. The thing you saw all those years ago, it's back. I nodded grimly. Looks that way, and I think it's hungry. We made our way back to Ethan's place in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. As we approached his cabin, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. Ethan, I said softly, reaching for my rifle. Did you leave that open? He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. Slowly, carefully, we approached the cabin. I took the lead, pushing the door open with the barrel of my gun. The interior was a disaster. Furniture overturned, claw marks gouged deep into the walls. And there, on the floor, was a set of tracks leading from the back door out into the woods. The same massive clawed prints we'd seen at the attack sites. It's been here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's hunting us now. Ethan's face was a mask of terror. What do we do? I checked my rifle, making sure it was loaded. We end this. Tonight. We spent the rest of the day preparing. I cleaned my rifle, making sure every part was in perfect working order. Ethan dug out an old shotgun he kept for home defense. We gathered supplies, flashlights, extra ammunition, first aid kit. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we set out into the gathering darkness. Our plan, if you could call it that, was simple. We'd set up in the clearing where Ethan said he'd heard the creature most often. With any luck, it would come to us, drawn by our presence. And then we'd see if bullets could do what my chainsaw hadn't 20 years ago. The moon was a thin sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to make the shadows seem alive. We huddled by a small fire, more for comfort than warmth. The woods whispered and creaked around us, and every time the wind gusted, I found myself jumping at shadows. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Ethan dozed fitfully, his shotgun clutched to his chest. I remained vigilant, my eyes scanning the tree line, my ears straining for any sound out of place. And then, just as I was beginning to think we'd made a mistake, I saw them, a pair of yellow eyes, reflecting the moonlight, slinking into view at the far end of the clearing. Ethan, I hissed, shaking him awake. It's here. The creature moved like oil on water, fluid and wrong. It froze when it seemed to sense us. That elongated head twisting from side to side, sniffing the air. My heart was a jackhammer in my chest as I raised my rifle. Wyatt, Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. Don't. But it was too late. I fired, the blast shattering the stillness of the night. The creature roared, a deeper, angrier sound than I remembered. It lunged forward, a blur of tattered fur and teeth. I stumbled back, fumbling for another shell, firing again and again. The gunshots seemed to drive it into a frenzy. It didn't retreat, didn't slink back into the shadows as any normal animal might. Instead, it charged straight towards us, propelled by rage and a hunger beyond my comprehension. Ethan's shotgun roared, the blast catching the creature in the shoulder. It staggered but didn't fall. I fired again, saw blood spray from its flank, but still it came. Run, I shouted, shoving Ethan towards the trees. We bolted, terror lending speed to our legs. I could hear it gaining, its snarls echoing through the forest. I stumbled, fell hard, rolled to my feet just as it reached me. I swung the rifle like a club, catching it on the side of its head. The blow sent it staggering back a step, buying me precious seconds. I scrambled deeper into the woods, branches whipping at my face. I'd lost sight of Ethan in the chaos. All I could do was run and pray. Finally, lungs burning, legs screaming, I collapsed behind a tangle of old-growth roots. I crouched there gasping, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then, a twig snapped nearby. I held my breath, finger on the trigger of my rifle. Slowly, I raised my head, peering over the roots. There it stood, not 10 feet away. In the pale moonlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Patches of fur missing, revealing gray, leathery skin underneath. Its face was a nightmare of mismatched teeth and those burning yellow eyes. And there on its shoulder was an old scar, the mark left by my chainsaw 2 decades ago. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just about hunger anymore. This was personal. It had been waiting, all these years, for me to return. With a roar that shook the very air, it leaped. I raised my rifle and fired, again and again, until the click of the empty chamber echoed in the night. The creature crashed into me, its weight driving me to the ground. Claws raked across my chest, teeth snapped inches from my face. I fought with everything I had, knowing that if I faltered for even a second, it would be over. Just as I felt my strength giving out, a blast rang out. The creature's head jerked to the side, dark blood spraying from a wound in its neck. It roared in pain and fury, momentarily forgetting me. Ethan stood there, his shotgun still smoking. "Get up," he yelled. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain from my wounds, and ran. Ethan kept pace beside me, pausing every few yards to fire another blast at the pursuing monster. We burst out of the tray line into a familiar clearing, the same one where we'd started this insane hunt. Our campfire was still smoldering, casting a feeble light. "The car," Ethan gasped. "We need to." His words were cut off as the creature exploded from the underbrush, slamming into him with terrifying force. They went down in a tangle of limbs and fur, Ethan's screams piercing the night. I looked around wildly, desperate for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on the campfire, on the half-burned log still glowing with embers. Without thinking, I grabbed one, ignoring the searing pain in my hand. I charged forward, swinging the makeshift torch like a club. The burning wood connected with the creature's face with a sickening thud. It reared back, howling in agony, paws clawing at its burning fur. I struck again and again, driving it back from Ethan's prone form. The creature's howls turned to whimpers, then to a low, keening sound that was almost human in its anguish. It backed away, those yellow eyes never leaving mine, filled now with something I never expected to see: fear. With one last baleful glare, it turned and fled into the darkness of the forest. I stood there, chest heaving, the smoldering log still clutched in my blistered hands. Slowly, I turned to where Ethan lay. "Ethan," I called softly, moving to his side. "Ethan, can you hear me?" He groaned, stirring weakly. "Is it?" I nodded, helping him to sit up. Yeah, it's gone. For now, at least." We made our way back to the cabin, supporting each other, both of us battered and bloody but alive. As we stumbled through the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Wendigo was still out there, nursing its wounds, its hatred. And someday, somehow, I knew we'd meet again. But for now, we had survived. And in the world of monsters and men, sometimes that's the best you can hope for. Months have passed since that night in the woods. Ethan's recovering, slowly but surely. The official story is that we were attacked by a bear. It's easier that way, simpler. Who'd believe the truth? I've moved back to the area, rented a small cabin not far from where my grandfather's old place used to stand. I tell myself it's to keep an eye on things, to be ready if the creature ever comes back. But deep down I know the truth. I'm waiting, watching. The hunter has become the hunted, and the game is far from over. Sometimes on those long, dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can hear it out there. A low, keening cry of hunger and hate. a promise that someday, somehow, we'll face each other again. And when that day comes, only one of us will walk away. Until then, I keep my rifle close, my eyes on the tree line, because out there in the vast wilderness, in the shadows between the known and the unknown, the Wendigo is waiting, and so am I. I, David Rodriguez, am now 78 years old, and the events I'm about to recount happened to me back in 2010. At the time I was 64, a pretty regular guy, maybe a little more stubborn than most. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up old cars and motorcycles in my shop in a small town called Millville, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. Life hadn't always been kind to me. I had gone through a rough patch after my wife of 30 years, Maria, left me for a younger man. It was a blow that nearly broke me, but I'm nothing if not resilient. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours at the shop, tinkering with engines and transmissions. My buddies would joke that I was married to my work now, and in a way they were right. It was a crisp autumn weekend when I decided to take a break from the monotony of my life. My old friend Boone Carpenter had inherited a cabin in the woods from his grandfather, and invited me out for some fishing and beers. Boone was the kind of guy you'd want around in a bar fight or if your car broke down in the middle of nowhere. Big burly, with a laugh that could shake the leaves off trees. Boone had been my friend since high school. "Come on, Dave," he'd said over the phone, his voice gruff but warm. "It'll be just like old times. A couple of geezers catching up, drinking beer, and maybe catching a fish or two." I couldn't resist the offer. The thought of getting away from the constant reminders of my failed marriage and the endless cycle of work was too tempting. So I packed up my old Ford pickup with some clothes, fishing gear, and a cooler full of beer and sandwiches. The cabin was about an hour's drive from Millville, nestled deep in the Allegheny National Forest. As I drove, the scenery changed from small towns and farmland to dense, dark forests. The leaves were just starting to turn, splashes of red and gold among the green. It was beautiful, but there was something about the density of the trees, the way they seemed to close in on the narrow road, that made me feel uneasy. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. It was a modest place, all wooden walls and a creaky porch, with a small dock that stretched out into a quiet lake. The water was like glass, reflecting the trees and sky perfectly. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. Boone was already there, setting up his fishing gear on the dock. He looked up as I pulled in, that big grin of his spreading across his face. "Dave," he called out, waving a beefy arm. "Took you long enough. Thought you might have gotten lost in these woods." I laughed and shook my head as I got out of the truck. "Nah, just took the scenic route. You know me, always stopping to admire a good view." We spent that first day like we were teenagers again, fishing, drinking, and swapping stories about the old days. Boone told me about his latest hunting trips, embellishing the tales with each beer. I talked about the new projects at the shop, the classic cars I was restoring, and the cantankerous customers who made my days interesting. As the sun started to set, casting an orange glow over the lake, Boone suggested we gather some wood for a bonfire. "Let's make this night a proper one," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. We wandered into the woods, just a little way from the cabin, talking and joking as we collected sticks and logs. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant hoots of owls. It was peaceful, but as we ventured further, something felt off. Boone noticed it too. He stopped in his tracks, his head cocked to one side. "Hey Dave, you hear that?" I listened but didn't hear anything unusual. "Hear what?" "That's just it," Boone said, frowning. "It's too quiet. No crickets, no nothing." I shrugged, trying to shake off the sudden chill that ran down my spine. Maybe they're just shy. "Come on, let's get back." We headed back to the cabin, loaded with wood, and got the fire going. We were sitting there, enjoying the warmth and the stars twinkling above us, when Boone suddenly looked serious. "You ever hear about those disappearances around here?" he asked, his voice low. I raised an eyebrow. "Disappearances? Like what? People getting lost?" Boone shook his head, staring into the flames. "Sort of. They say some folks who come out here just vanish. No trace, no nothing. Happened a couple of times over the past few years." I chuckled. but it sounded forced even to my own ears. Sounds like a campfire story, Boone. You trying to spook me? He shook his head again, his expression grave. I'm serious, Dave. It's not just stories. My grandpa used to talk about it. He said there's something in these woods, something that doesn't like people. I could see he was genuinely concerned, but I waved it off. Come on, man. We're just here for some fishing and beers. Nothing's gonna happen. But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We stayed up late, the fire crackling and the stars twinkling above us. Eventually we turned in, Boone taking the small bedroom, and I crashed on the couch in the living room. I fell into a fitful sleep, filled with strange dreams of dark shapes moving through the trees. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was like scratching, coming from outside the cabin. I sat up, listening, my heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, and then I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside me and crept towards the window. Peering out, I couldn't see anything at first, just the dark shapes of the trees and the faint outline of the lake. But then I saw it, a shadow moving, something large and hunched over. Boone, I hissed, trying to keep my voice low. Boone, wake up! He stumbled out of the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. What is it? I pointed to the window. There's something out there. He came over and looked out, his face going pale. What the hell? We stood there, frozen, watching as the shadow moved closer to the cabin. It was definitely not human, and the way it moved was wrong. Too fast, too jerky. Boone reached for his hunting rifle, which was propped up against the wall. Now what? I asked, my throat dry. Boone checked the rifle, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. We need to get out of here. Make a run for the truck. I nodded. We grabbed what we could. Boone with his rifle and me with the flashlight, and slipped out the back door trying to stay as quiet as possible. The plan was to make a run for the truck, but as we rounded the corner of the cabin, we saw it. The creature. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with long twisted limbs that seemed too thin to support its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, stretched tight over its bones. But it was the face that haunted me. Its eyes were large, glowing an eerie yellow in the darkness, and its mouth, God, its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of jagged teeth. It let out a low, guttural noise that sent chills down my spine, a sound that no earthly creature should be able to make. Run, Boone shouted, raising his rifle and firing a shot. The creature shrieked, a sound that pierced the night, and then it lunged at us. We bolted, sprinting through the trees, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear it behind us, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on us. Boone fired another shot, but it didn't seem to slow the thing down. We burst out of the woods and into the clearing where the truck was parked. Boone fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and I kept the flashlight trained on the trees, waiting for the creature to appear. Come on, I yelled, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. Finally, Boone got the door open, and we scrambled inside. He started the engine, and we tore out of there, gravel flying as we sped down the dirt road. I looked back and saw the creature standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. It didn't follow, just stood there, its eyes glowing in the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached town, our hearts pounding and our minds racing. We went straight to the sheriff's office, but of course they didn't believe us. They thought we were drunk or playing a prank. Boone was furious, but I couldn't blame them. It sounded crazy, even to my own ears. We never went back to that cabin. Boone sold it a few months later, and we tried to move on with our lives. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that scratching noise, and I wonder what the hell we saw out there. Boone and I drifted apart after that. He moved to a different state, somewhere far from the woods, and I buried myself in work, trying to forget. But every now and then, I'd hear about another disappearance, another person vanishing without a trace in those woods, and I'd remember the glowing eyes watching us as we fled. Years passed, and I tried to put it all behind me. I even started dating again, met a nice woman named Marla, who had no idea about my past. We got married, settled down, and life was good. But the memory of that night never really left me. One evening, Marla and I were watching the news when a story came on about a missing hiker in the Allegheny National Forest. My heart sank as I listened to the report. It was the same area where Boone's cabin had been. The reporter mentioned that several people had gone missing in that region over the past decade, and there were rumors of something strange in the woods. Marla noticed my expression and asked, "David, what's wrong?" I shook my head. "Nothing. Just brings back some memories." She looked concerned. "You never told me much about your time in Pennsylvania. What happened?" I sighed, knowing I couldn't keep it from her any longer. "It's a long story, and you might not believe me." Marla took my hand, her eyes filled with trust. "Try me." So I told her everything. About the cabin, the creature, the night we ran for our lives. She listened, her face growing pale, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long silence. Finally, she spoke. "David, that's terrifying, but I believe you. What do we do now?" I hadn't expected that response, and it took me a moment to gather my thoughts. "I don't know, I've tried to forget it for so long, but maybe it's time to do something about it." Marla nodded. "We should tell someone. Someone who might take it seriously." The next day, we drove to Pittsburgh and met with a journalist who specialized in paranormal and unexplained phenomena. His name was Harper Quinn, and he had a reputation for digging into stories that others dismissed as nonsense. "You're telling me there's a creature out there, in the Allegheny National Forest, that's responsible for these disappearances?" Harper asked, his eyes bright with interest. I nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but I saw it. Boone saw it too." Harper leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "All right, I'll look into it. But I need more than just your story. I need evidence." I thought about it. "There's the cabin. It might still be there. Maybe there's something we missed." Harper agreed to check it out. And a few days later, we all headed back to the forest. Marla insisted on coming along, despite my protests. "I'm not letting you face this alone," she said firmly. We found the cabin, now abandoned and overgrown with vines. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Harper took out his camera and started documenting everything, while Marla and I searched the place. As we combed through the cabin, I found an old journal hidden in a drawer. It belonged to Boone's grandfather. I opened it, and my heart raced as I read the entries. He had written about seeing the creature too, describing it in detail. He had tried to warn people, but no one believed him. Harper was thrilled. This is exactly what we need. Proof that this thing has been around for a long time. We spent the night in the cabin, keeping watch and hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature. It was a tense, sleepless night, but nothing happened. In the morning, we decided to leave, but as we packed up, we heard it. The scratching noise. It was coming from the woods, growing louder and closer. Harper set up his camera, ready to capture whatever came out. Marla and I stood by, hearts pounding, as the creature emerged from the trees. It was just as I remembered, tall and twisted, with glowing eyes and jagged teeth. It let out that same guttural noise, and Harper's camera captured every moment. He was in awe, but I knew we were in danger. "Harper, we need to go," I said urgently. But Harper was too focused on his camera. "Just a little longer. This is incredible." The creature moved closer, its eyes locked on us. Marla grabbed my arm. "David, we have to leave now." I nodded, pulling Harper away from his camera. "Come on, man, this thing is dangerous." Reluctantly, he followed us. But the creature wasn't going to let us go easily. It lunged at us, and we ran, sprinting through the woods just like before. Harper stumbled, and I turned back to help him up, but the creature was too fast. It grabbed Harper, its claws sinking into his flesh. He screamed, and Marla and I could do nothing but watch in horror. I pulled Marla along, knowing we couldn't save him. We ran until we reached the truck, breathless and terrified. We drove back to the city in silence, the weight of what we had seen pressing down on us. We reported Harper's disappearance, but the authorities were skeptical, as always. They sent a search party, but they found no trace of him. The footage Harper captured was enough to convince some people, but many still thought it was a hoax. Marla and I knew the truth, though. We had seen the creature, and we had the journal to prove it. We decided to move far away from Pennsylvania, settling in a quiet town in Oregon. We tried to live a normal life, but the memory of that night stayed with us. We never spoke of it to anyone else, but we kept Harper's camera and the journal as a reminder. Years later, I still think about Boone and Harper and the creature that took them. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I know it's out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. Maybe one day, someone will find it and put an end to the disappearances. But until then, I can only warn others to stay away from those woods. Some places are better left alone, and some creatures are better left undiscovered. But the weight of knowing, of having seen something that defies explanation, is a burden I'll carry for the rest of my days. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees, I swear I can hear that scratching sound, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. As I sit here, an old man with a lifetime of memories, I can't help but wonder, what if we had never gone to that cabin? What if we had just stayed in town, content with our simple lives? But then I remember the missing hikers, the unexplained disappearances that continue to this day. And I know that even if Boone and I hadn't encountered the creature, it would still be out there, hunting. It was on my 78th birthday that I made a decision. Marla had passed away a year earlier, leaving me alone with my memories and the evidence of our terrifying encounter. I couldn't take it to my grave. The world needed to know the truth. I reached out to a young journalist named Liam Foster. He had written a series of articles about unexplained phenomena in national parks, and something about his writing told me he might be open to hearing my story. When Liam arrived at my home in Oregon, I could see the skepticism in his eyes, but as I recounted my tale, showed him the journal of Boone's grandfather, and finally played Harper's footage, his expression changed from doubt to shock, and then to a grim determination. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "this is incredible. Terrifying, but incredible. We need to go back there." I shook my head. "No, son. I'm too old for that now. But I can give you everything I have. The journal, the footage, the coordinates of the cabin. Just be careful. That thing, whatever it is, it's dangerous." Liam nodded, his eyes bright with the thrill of the story. "I understand. I'll be careful, I promise." As he left with my box of evidence, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. But also a new fear. What if the creature got him too? For weeks I heard nothing from Liam. I tried to go about my daily routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd sent another young man to his doom. Then, one rainy afternoon, there was a knock at my door. Liam stood there, looking haggard and pale, but very much alive. "Mr. Rodriguez," he said, his voice hoarse. "You were right, about everything." I ushered him inside, made him a strong cup of coffee, and listened as he told me his story. He had gone to the Allegheny National Forest, found the overgrown remains of the cabin, and spent several nights camping in the area. At first, nothing happened, Liam said, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee mug. But on the third night, I heard it. That scratching sound you described. And then, I saw it. Liam had managed to capture more footage of the creature, clearer than what Harper had taken years ago. He had also found more evidence, claw marks on trees, strange tracks in the mud, and most disturbingly, what looked like a den deep in the woods, filled with bones. "I reported everything to the authorities," Liam continued. "This time they're taking it seriously. They've closed off that section of the forest and are sending in a team to investigate." I felt a mix of relief and dread. "Do you think they can stop it?" Liam shrugged. "I don't know. But at least now they know it's real. People will be warned, protected." In the months that followed, the story broke nationwide. Liam's article, backed up by the evidence we had collected over the years, caused a sensation. There were skeptics, of course, but the sheer volume of disappearances in the area, coupled with the footage and physical evidence, was hard to ignore. The government sent in teams of researchers, biologists, and even military personnel. The area around the cabin was cordoned off, declared a restricted zone. Theories abounded about what the creature could be. An undiscovered species, a mutant, even an alien. But the creature itself remained elusive. It was as if it knew it was being hunted and had gone into hiding. Months passed without a sighting, and gradually the media frenzy died down. Some began to suggest it had all been an elaborate hoax. Then, on a cold winter night, I received a call from Liam. His voice was urgent, excited. "Mr. Rodriguez, they found something. Not the creature itself, but you need to see this." The next day, Liam arrived with a file marked classified. "I shouldn't have this," he admitted, "but I thought you deserved to know." Inside was a report detailing the discovery of a cave system deep in the Allegheny forest. The caves were filled with primitive paintings, thousands of years old, and there, on the cave walls, were depictions of a creature that looked eerily familiar. Tall, twisted, with long limbs and a mouthful of sharp teeth. "It's been here all along," I whispered, my hands trembling as I looked at the photos. "All this time." Liam nodded. "The researchers think it might be some kind of ancient species, something that's managed to survive in isolation for thousands of years. They're calling it Homo allegheniensis. As I sit here now, nearing the end of my life, I feel a strange mix of emotions. Fear, yes, the memory of that night will never leave me, but also a sense of vindication, and oddly of purpose. My encounter with the creature, as terrifying as it was, led to a discovery that has changed our understanding of human evolution and the mysteries that still lurk in the dark corners of our world. The Allegheny National Forest remains partly closed. A team of researchers permanently stationed there to study and hopefully one day make contact with the creature. There have been no more disappearances since the area was restricted, but occasionally hikers in the surrounding forest report strange noises in the night, or glimpses of something tall and twisted moving through the trees. As for me, I've made my peace with what happened. Boone, Harper, and all the others who were taken, their deaths weren't in vain. They're part of a larger story now, one that will be told for generations to come. I often think about that creature, still out there in the woods. Is it the last of its kind? A lonely survivor of an ancient species? Or are there more of them, hidden away in other remote corners of the world? Perhaps we'll never know. But I do know this. The world is a stranger, more wondrous, and more terrifying place than most people realize. There are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that defy explanation. And sometimes, if we're brave enough, or foolish enough, we might just catch a glimpse of them. So if you're ever hiking in the woods, and you hear a strange scratching noise, or see a tall shadow moving in the trees, don't ignore it. But don't stick around to investigate either. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some creatures better left undiscovered.